The world is full of terrifying people, many of which have darker motives to get to know you than just be your friend. As a special treat, each and every artwork on screen today has been done by the incredible Anjexiant. Enjoy these amazing works, and don't forget to check out her channel, and stick around until the end of the video for a special message. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. Number 1. It started around my sophomore year in high school. I began getting creepy texts and phone calls, but never really thought much of them, since in those days, prank calls were a common thing to do. The messages and calls would come in consistently for a few weeks, and then just stop for a while. I honestly would forget that they'd even happened until they'd start back up. Around my junior year, the calls began getting creepier. They would call my house number along with my cell phone. It was around the time cell phones were starting to get popular. So, while some of my older friends still had my house number, it wasn't something I would give out to people anymore. When I started dating, they began calling my then boyfriend and would tell him awful things about me, and sometimes even know where I was at the time and to ask him questions about my whereabouts. It caused a lot of issues between us, but again, they would stop after a while, and apart from wondering who it would be, I never thought much of them again. Fast forward to college, I stopped talking to a lot of my friends from high school, and even deleted my old MySpace accounts and cleared friends from my Facebook, because I wanted to have a fresh start. We're still dating the same guy, but really stopped having contact with most people that I knew from high school. About halfway through my freshman year, the calls and text messages started up again. This time, with even more personal details about my life. Like always, right before I considered them serious enough to report, they would stop, and I would slowly forget they'd even happen. Sophomore year, I moved out of the dorms and into my apartment with 3 girls I'd met the year before. One night, I started getting the usual texts again, but this time, they were threatening to Photoshop nude pictures of me to send out to people who I knew. I tried ignoring them, but the texts were relentless and wouldn't stop. I would block one number, and they would come in from a different number almost immediately. I got really creeped out, and decided to change my number the next day. At this point, I wasn't sure who it could be, but I had become paranoid and stopped trusting everyone except my boyfriend. I isolated myself from friends and began going into a depression. I sometimes was sure it was so-and-so from high school, but could never come up with proof or anything. Fast forward a few months, and I am at a concert with my boyfriend. He got drunk that night, and we had gotten into a huge fight over it. I was home with my parents that weekend, and got home around midnight. At around 2 AM, the calls to my house phone started coming in. Yes, we still had a landline. One after another, we were getting calls from men asking for my sexual services. We tried blocking the calls like before. It was just different numbers one after another. Finally, we just unplugged the phone. The next morning, I had to explain to my parents what had been going on for years, and together we made a report and changed our landline number. Turns out, someone had put my phone number on Craigslist and listed me as a prostitute. By now, I finally began realizing that my boyfriend had been the one consistent during most of these incidents, and that our drunk fight that night could not have been coincidence with my number being posted on Craigslist. It took a few tries for me to leave the relationship, He was very manipulative, and I had spent years isolating myself from friendships and only trusting him. I finally left him that summer and chose to forget all these awful things that had ever happened. It took me a while to be healthy enough to start dating again, but when I did, I met a wonderful guy who is now my husband. I mentioned what happened to me before, but thankfully was emotionally distant enough from it so that we could just comment on how awful it was and move on. Last year, I began getting text messages again. I had a new phone, new number, new friend circle, and blocked anyone associated with the ex-boyfriend, and trusted the people in my life not to hand out my number to anyone. I was so scared when it started again. Thankfully, this time, I had my wonderful husband with me. After it happened a few times, where I would get text messages only when I was with my husband, and the text insinuated that he had been cheating on me, we decided that we weren't going to take a chance and it was just coincidence. We hoped that we weren't being followed, but the timing and content of the messages were obviously meant to cause a fight between us. We decided to make another police report, this time citing my ex-boyfriend as a suspect, and once again changed my number and limited the people who had contact with me further. Since then, I am happy to say that I have not gotten any unknown calls or messages. The detective assigned to my case attempted to contact my ex-boyfriend, but he was never able to. In any case, I think he realized that this time I was serious about pursuing legal action against him, and he stopped. I was lucky that this was the case, because technically, I did not have proof that it was him. Anonymous harassment is actually really difficult to pursue legally for many reasons, so thankfully, approaching him was enough to make it stop. When I think about this experience now, I realize how disturbed and manipulative that guy really was. I have no proof that the prank calls I got before I met him were him, but if I think about how I met him, it just looks so planned to me. Even though then it seemed like something out of a Nicholas Sparks movie, I hope that those calls were coincidence. But I really never know how far this guy went with his stalking of me. I'm just glad to be out of that relationship and to be emotionally healthy again. Number 2. I was about 12 or 13 years old. That particular day, I was walking to my psychiatrist for my weekly appointment. It's a half-hour walk and after dark. I enjoyed walking, especially after dark when things were quiet and peaceful, and slow, and no one else around. No, I didn't live in a dangerous neighborhood, nor did I walk through anywhere particularly dangerous. I'm about halfway to my destination, and a car, a Cadillac, comes driving down the street. Some people, both male and female, are in the car and sticking themselves halfway out the window and taunting and jeering at me as they drive by. They're a bunch of people in their late teens or early 20s. I ignore them and keep on walking. About a minute or two later, the same people come down the street again, and those people are jeering and taunting me. I don't know who they are. Maybe they live in their neighborhood. I still ignore them and keep walking. Another minute or so goes by, and again they come driving down the street, taunting and jeering me. Now I'm worried. They're circling the block over and over and deliberately focusing on me. As soon as they reach the corner and make their turn and are out of sight, I duck behind some bushes in someone's front yard and wait. The car comes again down the street, this time not seeing me walk down the street. They're not cheering. They pass right by me in my hiding place and turn the corner. I think that they assume that I finally reached my destination, one of the houses on the block, and went inside as a result. And when they turned the corner, I assumed that they'd driven away. But I was wrong. Stupidly, I leave my hiding place and go back to walking to my psychiatrist. I should have stayed there behind those bushes much longer, because I heard the car approaching. They spot me and start their taunting and jeering again. They turn the corner. This time I run towards my destination, but I know I won't get far before the car and those kids catch up with me again. So to that effect, I decide to hide again, behind the bushes in front of an apartment building. This time, resolving to stay there for good until the thugs in the car give up their search for me. I'm hiding there behind the bushes not for long, maybe about 30 seconds or so, when the guy whose apartment it is pops out from his apartment, asking what I'm doing in his bushes. At first, he thinks I'm probably a burglar or something, but I explain how I'm walking to my psychiatrist and how I'm being followed and harassed by a bunch of kids in a car, which is why I'm hiding in the bushes. The guy can instantly tell from my tone of voice and facial expressions that I'm telling the truth, and he sees how scared I am. Just then, the car comes down the street and pulls up right at the curb directly in front of us. They look at me and the guy I'm with. Not a mean-looking guy, in his late 30s or early 40s, but tough and serious-looking enough. He's not wearing a shirt, but he's wearing a sleeveless undershirt, which reveals that the guy's upper body is very well toned, slightly muscular and not fat. I'm looking at the car and realize that it's missing a few people inside. The car doesn't look so full now. The guy I'm with just gives them a mean stare. He asks me, "You know them?" I explain that no, I don't know them, and I haven't the slightest idea of who they are. Just then, as the car is sitting there, about 3 of them approach walking from the other direction. The car was traveling east to west, and the 3 were walking on foot from west to east, so that's why the car seemed not so full. They were looking to escalate the situation. They weren't satisfied with just driving by and taunting me. They changed tactics. A few of them got up out the car ahead and started walking towards me, while the other one in the car took a turn around the block. Their plan was now to physically trap me between themselves and the car, perhaps grab me and drag me in their car with them for whatever reason. But seeing my tough guardian angel with me, the kids decide to go into the car and take off. The guy offered to stay with me for a little longer, or if I wanted to duck in his apartment and stay there until I was sure it was safe to go on my journey. I had a feeling that would be the last I was going to see of those guys, and I didn't want to be late for my appointment, so I thanked the guy for his offer, but declined, and decided to go on my way. The guy went back into his apartment and closed the door. I looked at the closed door and hoped that I didn't make a mistake by turning down the guy's offer of better safety because I was still scared. Thankfully, I was right about not seeing the car again, and I walked the rest of my way unmolested. I reached my psychiatrist's office, and I told my therapist about what happened. He insisted on calling the police. The police came and took a report from me, and that's the last I heard of it. On my way back home, I usually take the same route I walk up from, up the same streets. But this evening, I varied my way home, taking some very different side streets to walk on. I never saw those cars, or the thugs, again. Number 3. Whilst growing up, we spent a few years in Topley, BC, Canada, a tiny incorporation, the epitome of rural. The bus took us home from school, but most days, one boy stayed behind for guitar lessons. Several times, my dad would pick him up and his guitar and take him home. He was cute and blonde and reminded us of John Denver, who was big back in the 70s. A few times my dad would bring him to dinner with us before taking him home. We moved to Burns Lake, a few kilometers away, so after that we didn't see much of him. Several years later, he was living in Burns Lake too, and his songwriting and guitar skills had developed a lot. and we were sure he was going to be a famous country singer. He even ended up dating my older sister, and he was teaching me chords on the guitar, and he was cutting the heavy drugs out of his life. I really liked him, and my sister seemed happy, but with her you could never really tell. His drug dealer was sampling his own wares, and he was paranoid, and when he learned that our John Denver was going off hard drugs, he decided that the musician had turned narc. My sister's boyfriend was found on Highway 16. He had been tied to a chair, wooden steel tubing style that are used in community halls. What my sister told me, he had been tied to this chair, run over and backed over 5 times. Since then, I have been terrified of anything remotely related to drugs. Number 4. After my wife and I had been dating for a year or so, we decided to get an apartment, even though we were both very young. She was 17 and I was 18, but we were both incredibly excited about our first apartment and getting away from our parents. The neighborhood was fairly nice, and our neighbors were all relatively young and friendly people. Most college students and young couples like us. We lived in that apartment for a little over a year without incident, until one afternoon, we decided to go kill time at a mall that was very near our apartment complex. A mutual friend of ours had a son whose birthday was right around the corner. So my wife and I decided it would be a nice idea to buy him one of those large Super Soaker style water guns. When we got back from the mall, we went straight back to our bedroom to lie down and have a cigarette. Somewhere along the line, my wife grabbed the water gun from the floor and in a playful way said, "You know what? I'm gonna go fill this up in the bathroom and shoot you with it." I just laughed. "Don't pick that fight, or you'll regret it," I said. After a couple of minutes, she grabbed the gun and made a beeline to the kitchen to fill it up. I went to our bathroom that was right across the hall from our bedroom. I'm not sure what my plan was, but I was sure it involved water, with whatever I could find. I grabbed a cup and started to fill it in the bathroom sink, when I heard my wife scream my name. It was loud, and she sounded terrified, as if she needed me to come her way immediately. I ran down the hall, and she was standing there at the entrance to our main room, where 2 people who we'd never seen before were now also standing, the front door wide open behind them, with keys hanging from the lock. I'd left them there. One was an elderly woman, maybe in her 60s, with a young girl, possibly around 15 or 16. Both wearing black dresses, and the youngest looked very pale. I stood in front of my wife and asked in a somewhat assertive tone, "Can I help you?" The older woman took a few steps in my direction, as if she were holding an invisible rifle, and in a stern voice said, "I'm going to take this, and I'm going to shoot you with it." Then she looked at my wife again and asked, "Do you always let her speak to you like that?" We both just stood there silently staring at the pair of them. I don't remember being too scared, just generally confused. After a moment, the younger girl started to reach for a necklace I was wearing and said in a really monotone and quiet voice, "I like your necklace. It's pretty." I snapped at her a bit and said, "Please don't touch me." "Listen, I need you to both leave now." They just stood there staring at both of us for what seemed like a year. Then I started to move towards the older woman, with my arm extended, as if I were going to push her out the front door. And no sooner than I took the first step in her direction, she began mocking what I said. "I need you to leave, I need you to leave." At this point she had a very aggressive look on her face, but was backing up towards the door nonetheless. Finally, they were both out in the main hallway, and I snatched the keys from the lock and shut the door, bolting it. I looked at the woman through the peephole and she just stood there, looking right back at me, gesturing at me with her invisible guns and yelling, "Shoot me? I'd never let a girl talk to me in that way." At this point I had chills, and my wife kept asking, "Are they leaving?" They finally left the main hallway area and began to linger out the front for a bit, until finally they began to walk up the main road. We sat at our window watching them walk away until they were finally out of sight. I'd never forget that woman's face, which I would regret something like 8 to 10 months later. I'd gotten a job in a Mexican restaurant, and I'd often go to the front of the store to see what the crowds are like to get a sense of how many tables I had coming up from the hostess. That's when I saw her again. I'm 100% sure it was her. There is absolutely no way I could ever forget that face, staring at me through the peephole and yelling those crazy things. The thing is, she was acting completely normal. She was wearing a nice clean red sweater with a white shirt beneath and blue jeans. This time, rather than being with a bizarre young girl, she had an older gentleman with her. They were waiting for a table, and I got as close as I could to try and listen to the nature of their conversation. They were talking about some cruise they had planning on attending. It all sounded very normal. It was the same woman who had been standing in my apartment, and it took every ounce of restraint I had not to confront her in the lobby of the restaurant. And I'm still not entirely certain why I didn't. I mean, I knew this was the same woman, but I'm not sure she did. She'd changed in some way. That's what I know, but I couldn't tell you exactly how. Number 5. A couple of years ago, my boyfriend and I went on an impromptu road trip. We packed up the car and the dogs and drove up to the far northern California redwoods. I was somewhat familiar with the area from the time that I was a kid, and it seemed very adventurous just heading out with no true destination in mind. A couple nights in, we ended up meeting up with a friend of a friend, grabbing some drinks, and she invited us to crash at her house for the night. We happily took her up on the offer because it saved us from dipping money into a motel or finding a camping spot. She lived in a super cool looking old Victorian house. Our friend normally had 6 roommates, including several guys, but since it was summertime and most of them were students, it was only her and another female roommate plus us. We drank some beers and hung out and then went to crash. Both roommates were upstairs, and my boyfriend and I, with our dogs, were crashing on a futon downstairs in a room that was right in front of the house, just off the front door. It was kind of a sitting room with a fireplace with big bay windows looking out into the front yard, which had very good cover of bushes. We both fell asleep easily and were deep in sleep until we were suddenly awakened by the doorbell ringing. Now this is an old Victorian, so it's an old school, deep ringing doorbell that you hear throughout the house. One of the residents of the house came down and opened the door and looked out and saw nothing. So we went back upstairs to bed. My boyfriend thought it was kind of weird, but you know, not our house. Maybe late night visitors were common. We fell back asleep and were awoken again sometime later by the doorbell. We heard the roommates come down again and look outside the door and shut it. This time, she walked into our room after and asked if we heard the doorbell. And we could tell she was weirded out. We told her not to try and open the door if it happens again, and all came to the conclusion that it must be the doorbell malfunctioning or something. The roommate goes back upstairs and we fall back to sleep. Next, I wake up to one of my dogs growling the most deep-throated growl I have ever heard from him. He absolutely loves people, even if they are strangers, and we live in the downtown part of a pretty major city, so having him growl at something at night is not normal. We chalk it up to being an unfamiliar house and ask him to be quiet. I fell asleep again, and next thing I know, I wake up to my boyfriend jumping out of bed and literally smacking the big bay window about 5 feet away from our bed and yelling. There's a man's face standing in the window staring at us. My boyfriend immediately grabbed an axe, since we had been camping and was right at hand, and chased the guy down the street. I'm sure whoever the creep was must have shit his pants. The whole commotion woke up everything, and we stayed up for the rest of the night keeping guard. The scariest thing to me is that the guy was probably casing the house. If he wanted to rob, there's no reason for him to ring the doorbell multiple times. He just wanted to see if it was only girls home, depending on who came to the door. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I'd like to give a huge thank you to Anjexiart for letting me use her amazing works in this video. As no doubt you can tell, she is an incredibly talented artist and creator, and helps me a lot with many of the artworks you've seen before and thumbnails in previous videos. And if you'd like to learn how to try and make artworks like these for yourself, then all you need to do is follow the link over to her channel and subscribe. She has many great videos with tips and techniques, so if you're interested in art, go over and show her some love. She really deserves it. Oh, look, the link is on screen. Go on, give it a click,